Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris, and I will be discussing the opioid crisis from the perspective of the Drug Enforcement Administration. The mission of the Drug Enforcement Administration is to control the substance laws in the United States at the federal level. So this is the agency that goes after the illegal supply, distribution, and selling of illegal narcotics domestically, as well as on an international level, going after those individuals providing those drugs from other countries. So the primary responsibilities for the Drug Enforcement Administration includes investigating drug crimes at the federal and international level. With that, at the international level, that entails coordination with international law enforcement entities as well as state and local law enforcement entities to go after these drug criminals and overall to help maintain a robust drug intelligence program. With regards to the intelligence aspect of the Drug Enforcement Administration, their role relies on collecting, analyzing, and disseminating strategic and operational drug intelligence from the DEA website. The opioid crisis in the United States has become one of the biggest challenges for the Drug Enforcement Administration as well as for the intelligence wing of the Drug Enforcement Administration today. When we take a look at data from the CDC in 2022, we see that statistically the majority of opioid drug overdose deaths were fentanyl related. In general, opioid usage has seen overall increase in all forms of illegal opioid narcotics. When we talk about prescription opioid deaths, they have seen somewhat of a smaller increase, but when we're taking a look at synthetic opioid deaths, we can see a large 56% increase in deaths overall. Taking a look at the history of opioid usage in the United States, we can break it down into three ways. When we take a look at 1999, around the new millennium, we saw an overall increase in prescription opioid deaths. In 2010, those statistics were mostly from an increase in heroin opioid deaths. And in 2013 to the present, what we're seeing today is an overall increase in deaths from synthetic opioids, again, fentanyl related, according to data from the CDC. So under the umbrella of the opioid crisis, the issue of fentanyl abuse in the United States is particularly alarming for the Drug Enforcement Administration for several reasons. Again, when we take a look at CDC data in 2022, 60% of opioid deaths were fentanyl related. The reason why fentanyl abuse is such a big deal is because this drug is extremely potent and suppliers often mix fentanyl with other opioids such as heroin to increase their potency. Thus, some scholars say that fentanyl is 50 times more potent than other opioid narcotics, i.e. heroin. Another big issue of concern is the fact that fentanyl is cheap to produce and to ship. When we take a look at data from RAND researchers, we found that several Chinese suppliers were willing to ship a kilogram of fentanyl for as little as $2,000 compared to other opioid narcotics that would cost much more than that amount. So now that we discussed some context of the opioid crisis in the United States, this brings us to our intelligence question of, over the next decade, how is the opioid crisis likely to evolve in the United States? Again, the mission of the DEA is to combat illicit narcotics from destroying communities, from destroying lives in the United States overall. Again, this issue has been a major crisis for the DEA, and so understanding how the epidemic will evolve over the next 10 years will help leadership within the DEA develop a more effective strategy to combat this issue. So to answer this intelligence question, there will be an examination of several hypotheses that we will look closely at over the next few slides. Among them include the claim that white Caucasian males will lead the demographics of illegal opioid users in the next decade, that fentanyl will continue to be the most common cause of opioid overdose deaths, that there is a positive correlation between low income and opioid deaths, and as a result, economic downturns will result in increased opioid usage in the United States. So to help answer these hypotheses, our first analytical method that will be utilized is network analysis. To conduct network analysis, we will be utilizing Gephi software to help visually identify important trends in the United States. The following network analysis slides will have nodes that represent US states and edges which will be color-coded to represent demographics in opioid overdose data. So some of the associated variables will be deaths by race, ethnicity, gender, and again, these will be color-coded. So for deaths over 2,000 individuals, this will be the color purple. For deaths over 1,000 will be red. Deaths over 100 will be blue, and deaths under 100 will be represented in green. So then there's the question of why network analysis? Well, according to Heer and Fearson, network analysis is most effective to make sense of the data by grouping associations, identifying patterns among a certain group. And so with regards to the opioid crisis, network analysis can help us make prediction of how the opioid crisis will evolve over the next several years by capturing important trends through our network analysis with Gephi software. So in addition to network analysis, our project will also feature spatial analysis using tools like ArcGIS. The neat feature about ArcGIS is that this will help us build maps that will help answer our hypothesis by showing important patterns and trends in important variables such as demographics, socioeconomic status, and will overall show a depiction of which regions of the country are hit the hardest by the opioid epidemic to help offer support for our hypothesis of urban versus suburban, low income, and other demographic factors listed in our hypothesis. Spatial analysis will be used for this project because it allows the viewer to make important correlations, identify patterns, and draw important conclusions from a large volume of data. Layered data on maps helps us to formulate hypotheses by comparing information with regards to location. We can identify patterns based on geographic locations and see what variables are associated and not associated in a particular location. Overall, spatial analysis is best for presentation style briefing because it demonstrates to the viewer, to the audience, meaningful correlations of a large amount of data on a single map or chart. So now that we just discussed the analytical tools that were utilized in this project, we will now examine the claim that will be used to support our intelligence question. Specifically, there are 5 distinct characteristics that will shape the opioid crisis over the next decade. Number 1, that fentanyl will be the primary cause of opioid overdose deaths, and that the majority of opioid overdose victims will be male, and that there will be Caucasian non-Hispanics. Additionally, the New England area and some parts of the South will be the epicenter of the opioid epidemic, and low-income areas will experience the most devastation from the opioid crisis. When we take a look at the opioid trends by location, data from 2014-2017 demonstrates meaningful characteristics about the opioid crisis. The bottom line is that there has been more deaths in the northeastern New England area, some parts of the South, compared to Midwest and West Coast states. From 2014 to 2016, ArcGIS data shows a majority of states in the New England area experiencing a 14 to 26 and 26 to 35% increase in opioid overdoses, as is represented through brown and purple color coding. Now, compared to western states like California, by contrast, they showed a 1 to 15% increase in opioid overdoses, as is represented by yellow color coding. Now, when we look at data from 2017, fentanyl overdose deaths by region supported the same conclusion, that there are still more opioid overdose deaths by fentanyl in the New England and some southern states compared to the West Coast. This data broke down opioid overdose deaths per population of 100,000. Now, as we can see in red, Northeast states had the highest overdose deaths of 12, 17, and 22 for every 100,000 individuals, compared to West Coast states represented in blue, only showing 1.5, 1.7 deaths for every 100,000 individuals. So now that we've offered support showing that the majority of opioid overdose deaths in the New England area, let's turn to a network analysis of opioid deaths by race and ethnicity. In this analysis, the nodes will be U.S. states, and the edges will represent an association by Caucasian non-Hispanics. Opioid overdose deaths over 1,000 will be represented in red. Deaths between 100 and 1,000 will be represented in blue, and deaths from 0 to 100 will be represented in green. When we look at the data, we can see that there are a great number of associations among East Coast states with Caucasian deaths over 1,000, as shown in red. But we can also see that the majority of associations are in blue, representing a range of 100 to 1,000 deaths. And lastly, we can see that there is a minority of associations in green, representing a range of 0 to 100 Caucasian deaths. Now, when we break down this data even further by looking at Black non-Hispanics, we can see an interesting comparison. On the previous slide, there were a majority of associations for blue representing 100 to 1,000 and a great handful of red associations over 1,000. In this slide, we can see an association of majority to be green, again 0 to 100 deaths, and a great handful of association of blue, 100 to 1,000. So we can make the conclusion, at least compared to Black non-Hispanics, that there are more Caucasian non-Hispanic deaths by opioid overdose deaths than Black non-Hispanic. Now, when we look at the data of Hispanic opioid overdose deaths, we can see a similar trend compared to Black non-Hispanic. We can see that the majority of associations among states are shown in green and some blue. Again, when they compare this to Caucasian non-Hispanics, we can see once more that the data shows that the majority of opioid overdose deaths were Caucasian non-Hispanic, and that there were fewer Hispanic and Black opioid overdose deaths among the states. So now that we demonstrated a network analysis in support of the hypothesis of Caucasian victims, we will demonstrate support for opioid overdose victims by gender. The network analysis for gender was performed in the same way as that done for race and ethnicity. In this analysis, we can see an association in purple. Purple represented an association of overdose deaths of over 2,000 victims. So when we look at the data, we can draw the following conclusions. Some states were associated with over 2,000 male opioid overdose deaths. A significant number of East Coast states had over 1,000 male deaths. The majority of states had between 100 and 1,000 male deaths, shown in blue, and a few had 0 to 100 male deaths, as shown in green. So what we conclude from this analysis is that a majority of states were associated with a significant amount of male opioid overdose victims. Now, when we do the same analysis for female opioid overdose victims, we can draw the following conclusions. We can see here in our network analysis that there is a majority of association of states in blue, again representing 100 to 1,000 deaths, and a good amount of states associated in green, 0 to 100, and some associated in red, over 1,000. So we can conclude from this analysis that there are more male deaths by opioid usage than female deaths. Lastly, we will use ArcGIS spatial data to test the hypothesis of low income and opioid usage. Our analysis here features a map layer of opioid deaths, the lowest number represented in yellow and the highest figures represented in dark red. The other layer represents median income, the highest income represented in green, and the lower income represented in white and brown. When we overlap the layers, we can draw the following conclusions. The darker red states showing the highest opioid overdose deaths also showed a majority of income areas between 46,000 and 76,000 and 16,000 to 46,000, and very few areas with income above $100,000 per year. Consequently, we can conclude that the lower income areas will have a higher propensity for opioid usage due to the usual correlation with higher crime. Additionally, we can infer that an economic downturn in the future will see a correlation with an increase in low-income areas, and thus resulting in a higher rate of opioid usage and deaths accordingly. So in conclusion, the opioid crisis has been a major intelligence priority for the Drug Enforcement Administration for decades. Fentanyl in particular has been specifically troublesome for the Drug Enforcement Administration because of the following characteristics. As mentioned by CDC data, 67% of all opioid overdoses in the United States in 2022 were fentanyl related. It's a highly addictive, highly potent, and very cheap drug to produce. Overall, our analysis focused on 5 distinct traits that will likely characterize the opioid crisis in the future. That there will likely be a pivot towards northeasterly states in the opioid crisis. That fentanyl is likely to be the common opioid involved in cases of overdose. That most opioid victims will be Caucasian, non-Hispanic. And that most overdose victims will be male. Low-income areas, additionally, will see greater incidence of opioid overdoses. Thank you for listening.